there are things that designers have in their tool set that are going to be really important. One is the continuing empathy and kind of human-centered portion of it, and then also this sort of ethical orientation that most, I would say, designers have as well, and pushing in that direction. And then also, frankly, learning how to adapt and use these systems as tools to help us become better designers. I think the designers that stick around are going to be the ones that have become adept at using these as tools, as accelerants, and as sort of extensions of our own capabilities.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Edit Undo podcast. We have got a very special guest today, but before we get into that, it is almost the end of the year. It's the 20th of December right now. You're probably listening to this a little bit later on, but it is, it's that time of the year when we start to reflect a little bit, think on how the year has gone. And so I'm quite interested in the topic we're going to discuss today, because in some ways it will help me reflect on some of the things that I've been getting up to this year. But with no further ado, today we are speaking to Eli Woolery, and he is both an educator and a practitioner. At InVision, he is a senior director of design education, and he is also one of the lecturers at Stanford. And I'm not going to go into any of the detail on that side, because I'd really like us to get some of the story around how that actually happened. But Eli, welcome to the show, and it is great to have you.
Thanks so much, Alfie and Stephanie. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, I think especially for everyone listening, if they've started out in a design career or any digital design career, and they heard the word InVision, they immediately feel like they've connected with you in some level, because the brand in itself already has such a story and a relationship with so many designers. This was such a pivotal part of a lot of the technologies that came about to assist designers in their careers. So I almost feel like we already kind of connect on some type of level.
Yeah,
definitely.
Well, thanks for saying that. I mean, certainly, even before I started the company, I had a strong connection to the product, because I used it a lot myself for design, and it's been great to be a part of the team.
One of the things that I didn't mention in your introduction, because I'd like us to tie it into the story, but I think anybody who's kind of looked for a podcast to learn a little bit more about design, I'm sure will be kind of familiar with this voice, and they'll be kind of scratching their head a little bit, wondering where they know this voice from. But I think there were two podcasts that kind of really got me into the idea of podcasting and design. The first was, I think it's called High Resolution. Was a good podcast, but it was just one season.
Jared was on that, right?
That was one of the ones that I first, I think it was the first one I found. And then there's the Design Better podcast. I mean, it's been one of the foundational podcasts of, I think, especially for the people who learn remotely. Things like that actually make a really big difference. So it's really, in some ways, an honor to have you on the show.
Well, it's an honor to be here, and I'm so glad that the podcast has been helpful. Certainly in my career too, I lean on podcasts and other audio content a lot for learning. So it's nice to be able to pay it back a little bit.
Definitely. But I guess, we could talk about all of the different stripes and accolades, but let's maybe, before we get into all of that, let's turn the clock back a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit of the origin story? But I think one of the lenses that I'd like us to kind of use as we kind of go through this conversation is the parallel between education and practice, just generally. And so can you tell us, like, where did it all start with you, both from the perspective of the career that you're in, but then also the aspect of education that you also play a part in?
Sure. So it's sort of a winding, weird path, but I'll try to kind of wind our way to it without too much too much awkwardness. So I trained in the undergraduate product design program at Stanford, and that program was actually situated in the mechanical engineering department. So we were at the time really focused on physical products, although digital products were starting to make sort of an entrance into the scene. This is the mid-late 1990s, sort of like as the first .com boom was just getting rolling, and the first commercial internet browsers were becoming available. So my original sort of educational focus was on design, but more on physical products. Although I think the fundamentally the foundation of the program there is really about human-centered design and design thinking. And David Kelly was my advisor, and he was obviously a big force behind popularizing design thinking, and through IDEO and through the D School, which he later founded at Stanford. So that was sort of the origins of my training. And then I spent time. I took a small diversion actually to Bermuda, where I was we don't have to dive into that story, but I got into diving there, and I wanted to sort of use my background and also work on something that was sort of in the underwater realm. So I got a job doing physical product design for a company called Light and Motion, which does underwater video and also bike light equipment, and which is a lot of fun. So it was kind of like a master's degree in the actual sort of art of making a product. It was a vertically integrated manufacturer, so we had a machine shop on the ground floor, and we would build the products ourselves, prototypes, all the way through manufacturing. We were sort of one of the few remaining companies, and this changed over the course of my tenure there, that was still building a lot of our products in the United States versus overseas in China or other areas where labor is less expensive. So really great training in that regard, and I was still using my design training. But after a number of years, I felt like my kind of learning curve had sort of asymptoted, and I wanted to keep diving into new areas, no pun intended. But so I was really interested throughout that course of my career, both in photography, because I was doing a lot of underwater photography, just testing the equipment I was designing, but also marine science. And I got a little taste of that marine science I mentioned when I was in Bermuda. And so I ended going back to schools for a master's degree in marine science. And it was fantastic. It was really interesting, being on that side of things. But I pretty quickly discovered that I wasn't a scientist. I just didn't have the patience and the sort of ability. The field work was great, being out with animals, but then that's sort of the minority of your work. Majority is like, grant proposals and doing statistical analyses and things that I just wasn't as keen on. So I ended up I finished all my coursework, but dropped out before doing my thesis, and I started a magazine with a friend of mine, an underwater photography magazine, and I ran that for about 3 years. And it was another sort of like, master course in this time in print design and in like, what does it take to launch and market a magazine, which was very educational. It was also, the timing was not fantastic, because this is around the time of the financial crisis, and a lot of magazines were pulling back on their advertising and basically shifting companies were pulling back on advertising and shifting all the focus to digital versus print advertising. So it was kind of tough to get advertisers, and we ended up having to fold the magazine, but it was great while it lasted, and I learned a lot. And then after that, I knew I wanted to try to continue to do something entrepreneurial. I didn't know what that was. I didn't have really anybody in mind that I wanted to work with. So I applied to this program called Runway, which was run through a venture capital firm called Innovation Endeavors, which is Eric Schmidt's VC firm. He was the ex-Google CEO. And essentially, if you get in, they hook you up with a team, and then they give you some money to work on entrepreneurial problems. So got into that. And my co-founders and I worked on our focus was sort of on small business problems, and we bounced around a lot, and we ended up, what we discovered, I think, was that it's hard enough to start a company if you're working with people that you already know and you know what you want to work on. It's probably 10 times as hard if you come into the situation with no real idea of what you want to work on and not knowing
Yeah.
the founders. So it was just too many variables to control for. So we ended up kind of breaking up, but I continued to work on my project for a while. But then it was around that time that, I had some interest in teaching probably, later in my career, but I thought, why not, kind of dip my toe in it at that time. And so I went back to the program where I got my undergrad training at Stanford and essentially offered to be a coach for the capstone class for seniors. And that the capstone class is a 2-quarter class where students come up with a sort of user group they want to work on with, or a focus area, and try to come up with a product and bring it as close to the, quote unquote real world as they can. And so I was a sort of an industry coach for the first year, and then the director of the program asked me to stay on as a lecturer. So I've been a lecturer in that program for the past 10 years. And, the program's changed a little bit. Certainly the students, I feel, have definitely evolved over the years. The focus remains the same. And so, yeah, it's a really great experience just trying to coach these kids through their projects. And, most of them just treat it as a class project. And at the end of the year, they open source it or donate, the project if somebody's open to that. But small fraction actually turn it into entrepreneurial venture. So there's a handful of teams that have gone on to start companies afterwards. And that's really fun for me because I have a little bit of that entrepreneurial background. I like helping out those kinds of companies. So, tons of teams. So that's where the education came in. And then with InVision, I had just left a smaller startup and was sort of looking for the next thing. I knew I wanted to be remote. And at the time, this is 2015, there weren't that many remote tech companies. It was sort of, the definite minority. And they were one of the few. They've been remote since the very beginning. And so I had a conversation with a fellow who became a good friend and my boss, Aaron Walter. And he ended up bringing me onto his very nascent design education team. And so we were sort of tasked with elevating design practice in all different types of organizations. And again, if you rewind now back to that era, which isn't too long ago, but I think, a lot of the big tech companies like Google and Apple, of course, and Facebook and others already understood the power of design and how to play a strategic role. But if you think of the other kind of more legacy companies like the banks and the healthcare companies and those types, not many of them really understood that. They still treated design more as a service and something to sort of be slapped on at the end. So our goal was really to help those companies adopt better design practices. And our method of doing that was to create a lot of content. So first thing we did when we started there was to write 3 books together on design thinking and design leadership. And then we started a podcast, a Design Better podcast, as a way to also explore these topics. And, I think it was I would say that over the years, we largely succeeded in many ways with our mission and really did help elevate design. It wasn't just our team too. We had other, teams helping us and other ones like more community focused teams, the Design Leadership Forum. There's other things too that kind of helped in that regard. But that's sort of where the two came together for me, the design, the more hands-on product design and the education side of things.
Yeah. So there were 2 things that you mentioned, and I definitely want to go into how that the actual aspect of education in a design organization, like how that came to be and what it was like. But before we do that, there were 2 things that you mentioned that kind of stood out to me. And the first was in the first place where you worked at where you were doing the diving and kind of like the equipment. And you mentioned the fact that it was a vertically integrated company. And
Yes.
Can you just chat a little bit about what that effect has? Because I think especially with the way design exists now in the software world, it's very easy to not get vertically integrated, even in a software project.
Sure.
And can you just talk a little bit about either maybe how it changed your perspective, kind of seeing it from the very basic resource right until the final product, or just how that affects your thinking?
Sure. Yeah. So, vertical integration in the sort of physical product realm essentially means that everything is under one roof. Maybe not literally. You might have different buildings working on different parts of the product, but essentially everything is built in-house. In our case, it was under one roof. We were a small company, and we had a building on Cannery Row in Monterey. It was actually a really beautiful place to work. You could look out the window from your desk and see like whales going by sometimes, dolphins, otters, that kind of thing. So pretty special place to work.
But that's crazy.
But yeah, as far as how it affected how I, view design, I think from a sort of learning and training perspective, it was fantastic because you got to touch every part of the design process, from like the first sketches you do to the first, CAD models, at that time largely working in things like Pro Engineer, I think that's what it was, Pro E, and then later SolidWorks. And then, turning those designs into actual machine metal parts or injection molded parts, seeing how those things fit together. And then, all the way through like the packaging of the product and shipping it out to customers. And then inevitably, getting feedback, not always positive, that you had to iterate on and change the next version of the product. And, I was actually talking to when I was on another podcast yesterday, I was talking about this, and the question they asked was, what is the sort of intrinsic difference between, physical product design and software design? And I think it really comes down to the, speed of distribution and ability, low cost iteration, relatively low cost in software, because obviously with this physical product, you ship it out and then you can't make changes afterwards, right? But with software, you ship it out and you can, instantaneously, essentially, especially if it's a web product, make changes. And that's a very big difference. And I think there's pros and cons to that. I mean, there's something very satisfying with the physical product about actually shipping, like physically shipping something, it's done.
Yeah.
It's out in the world, for better or worse. It's out of your hands, whereas software often feels like it's never done, right? It's always this constant iteration. There's no real end, which can be kind of like exhausting over time. So that's largely what the things I learned in that setup.
It's a very interesting thing you noted there about the dynamic or process of physical product versus digital product and how they get shipped into the world. And I also feel it's almost because it's a non-physical product that we're working on, that maybe sometimes we have more reluctance to actually push it live. If you look at the amount of projects that actually don't go out into the world, it's like you say, because it's always a constant work in progress. We have this constant need to get to that finish line before we show it to the world, and that kind of just enables this procrastination even more and more and more, because it's so easy to just add on a little bit more in a non-physical world than it is to add on another piece to a physical product.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sort of, there's an attraction to that, but also a danger in that you're going to, in the end, have a much better product if you get it out early and get feedback and are able to iterate on it versus holding on to it for too long. Yeah.
I did have a question regarding, I'm not sure if it was an intentional decision or path that you decided to take, but you've had quite a bit of experience in both working on physical products as well as digital products. And at some point, it seems like it wasn't physical or digital products that were the deciding factor for you in your career, but correct me if I'm wrong, but more around the process and the making thereof, because you spoke about, how the design thinking process was very key to what you were interested in when you went back to Stanford, when you were thinking about design leadership. I think, that those principles and methodologies can apply both to a physical product company versus a digital product company. But was that intentional decision, or what was that decision-making process that you took to move from physical product design to a digital product space?
Yeah, so I think to sort of zoom out on that question a little bit, I did this thing years ago. Actually, it was when I was applying for that program I mentioned, where I sort of laid out my career on a timeline. And it sort of showed just various things that I've done. And what I realized after a while, because I was still using it to show to like prospective employers, was that it might have not been the best thing to share, because it sort of just seemed like I had a short attention span. It was like jumping around to all these different weird things. And I think that's probably true to some degree, but also I just, I really like learning new things. And so, with the physical product thing, not that I had mastered it by a long shot. I think you could spend a lifetime doing that, but I learned a lot, and I felt like I was ready for something different. And, hence the bounce over to marine science for a bit, and then into magazines, et cetera. And I'm still learning. And in my current role is the first time where I've not been really kind of creating something like either a product or like a digital or physical product to ship out into the world, but rather it's more, content, essentially, books and podcasts, et cetera. And I found I really enjoyed that, and I want to continue I think, doing that for a while. And not that I wouldn't go back to the product world, but there are certain things about that world that I personally find quite stressful that you don't necessarily have when you're working on a podcast or even writing a book. It's just like the things that can go wrong, the dependencies, all those things. I'm glad I went through it. I'm glad I did it for a long time. And maybe at some point I would go back to it. But yeah, I'm definitely enjoying being more on the sort of teaching and content side of things.
Yeah. So I've got a question, and it's in some ways a little bit of a selfish question. And it's like that transition when you went from specifically building products to more focusing on creating content around the process. Like, what did that look like for you? Because in some ways, those are two very different jobs. Like going from designing things to talking about designing things. Like the activities involved are very different.
They are.
Yeah, Alfie just wants to quit his job.
This is not me asking for an instruction manual to follow.
Asking for a friend and myself.
Right. Exactly. No, definitely. I think, they are very different. And I think, given that you've had experience in the design world, I think the challenging thing that I see maybe some younger designers do, and I don't see this often, but is maybe like jump straight into the content side of things. I think you do need some grounding and actually having gone through the various processes, and more than just in an academic setting, to really have empathy for the people that are doing it. And I don't think it's not that it's not possible, but I think it's really helpful if you had some, real world experience in these fields. But the activities are different. But there are some interesting, overlaps. And one of the things, this is another thing that I mentioned in my podcast interview yesterday, but we've had a couple times the great honor of having Sir Johnny Ive, in our class at Stanford, and once virtually and once in person. And one of the things that he said that was to me very surprising was that he starts all of his projects with writing at Apple and now. And the reason he does that is because I'm sure he's very adept at sketching, but he feels that it's too constraining, and that when you're in the very early stages of a product, if you can write about it and convey some of the emotion that you want to imbue the product with, that's a very important aspect of things. And that I didn't really start writing for work until this current role, but then I realized that wow, there's some real power here if you can if you can include writing as a fundamental part of your process. That really opens some doors. And so I think there is that overlap between, being a content creator and being a designer. The written word, the spoken word, those kind of skills will suit you well if you can get some practice with both.
Yeah, definitely. Just a quick thing that kind of came to mind, because that sort of reminded me a little bit of, I think in one of their books, Amazon do a sort of similar thing that they call like the customer letter technique. Yes. Where you start your project off with writing what it's going to be.
Yes,
and
they do. Yes,
it's very interesting that writing is kind of like the first thing that quite a few successful and mature companies kind of start the process off with that, because you wouldn't expect it, especially a bunch of designers.
Right. No.
Yeah, with all our spelling mistakes.
Right. Well, thankfully, the AI writing tools are getting better and better. So,
See, Figma introduced spell check last week. Thank goodness.
Yeah, I did see that. I'm curious why it took them so long, actually. I mean, it's been around in other tools for a while.
Yeah.
I want to quickly go back to Alfie was quite interested, the bridge of going from being very involved in as a design practitioner and then going to being more of a content creator, especially focused around educational content. I'm quite interested in, firstly, you're a lecturer at Stanford, which is, I mean, I haven't had the privilege to speak to anyone else who's lecturing at Stanford. And I'm pretty sure it's a very different environment to be lecturing at a university or institute like Stanford versus a normal university elsewhere. Because, and I'm making a lot of assumptions here, that the people that enroll in those programs are a lot more focused or intentional, because that's a very prestigious place to go to. You need to have your wits about you.
Or at least that's what we assume.
So you get all kinds of students, and again, it kind of ranges, like I was talking about earlier in the product, the capstone program, from those that just want to sort of get through the class and get a grade and graduate, to those that are really, really excited about design and entrepreneurship and want to carry the product forward after the program. So you get a range, and I'm sure that's true of most universities. I think one of the things that maybe makes Stanford a little different is that it feels like each student almost has a hidden superpower. Like there's some reason that they're there that's maybe not immediately obvious. And so one of the kind of interesting things we've started to do recently is like a little talent show. So we called it Lowering the Bar Talent Show, where the teaching staff goes and does a pretty horrible rendition of a song in front of class. And then we invite the students to come up and do things. And it's often amazing. Like they're just very accomplished musicians or dancers or other things. And so, so that's kind of an element that you might not find in other places so much. But yeah, I think, fundamentally the thing that excites me again is getting kind of more so than the front of class stuff, which I don't even actually do as much anymore. I've kind of stepped back to sort of more operational role, but is the one-on-one interactions with students, getting to know them, helping them with their career, because they're heading out into the job market most often after graduating, or helping them, if they're going to start a company. Those are the kinds of things that I get really excited about. So,
yeah, that's amazing. And like kind of as you're speaking, like one of the things I was thinking about is, I guess especially as kind of outsiders looking in, and what really the experience is the brand name. It's easy to believe that it's that there's this perfect fairy tale place where smart people go and amazing things come out. But I think the thing that makes like a learning institution especially significant is that it can facilitate any potential in different forms. And I think that's the thing that's interesting, because when you're sort of speaking earlier and describing the process, there's sort of like an aspect specifically in the capstone class that you're bringing something to the world. And for me, that's the thing that's really special. And it's, in some ways, it's a basic idea in some ways. It's like, if you want to learn a thing, do it in real life. But many places actually don't facilitate that process, and in some ways, that's kind of what can make it special, because it's always different when a thing is embodied rather than just learned theoretically.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, that's very true. And I think there are probably other classes that do that. I know there's other classes in the design realm that do it, and I'm sure in the business school too. I don't know in the other departments how many give you that kind of real world experience. And we've debated over the years, do we have assigned projects sometimes, or offer the option to give you an assigned project or assigned team? But it seems like that this is one of the few opportunities that they have at school to choose the people that they want to work with, and then choose the project they want to work with, and also ideally bring it to the real world. And that kind of combination, I think, is pretty powerful. And it's a reason why the class has been popular for so long. We're actually the class on the major. The major is the third most popular at Stanford at this point.
Sure.
Wow.
Congrats.
Yeah.
That's massive.
That's amazing.
That is amazing.
And so I kind of had a question about that sort of area specifically, because I've kind of had like an idea that's floated around my mind quite a while, specifically around practice in education. And I think this is a great opportunity to get an opinion from someone who is actually on the ground and isn't just dreaming about things like I am. But like in the context that you were describing, where people are actually doing a real world project and so on, if you had, in a sense, private enterprise or business, in a sense, kind of approach you and said, you know, we want to invest in education and we want to help the process that you're enabling with these younger students, what kind of role would you want to see them play if it was kind of completely up to you?
That's a good question. And we've actually done that in the past a little bit. We had an affiliate program. So we would essentially ask a company for a donation and they would provide a project brief for student teams. And it was interesting. And, you know, I think we had some interesting projects come out. We feel that in the long run, it wasn't quite a good fit for what the students wanted. Largely because, again, going back to the idea of like choosing your team, choosing your project, bringing it to the real world, it sort of kind of interrupted some of those parameters a bit. So we decided not to continue with that. There are other classes in the program that continue to have those relationships, and I think they work better in sort of different contexts. But for us, it wasn't quite the match. And I'm glad we experimented with it, but we're not carrying it forward currently.
Yeah, because I was just thinking, I was thinking about it, and initially I had a similar sort of idea, like they might give a brief, and in a sense, that way they get some real world experience. But the other thing that I kind of thought about that's on a similar kind of vein is more something near a hackathon type of opportunity. So it's more like a competition that the business enabled, and then you can, in a sense, build an idea that you think is relevant.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting too, to do it in a kind of more constrained way. And I think there could be some interesting opportunities there. You know, the one tricky thing that you might, it would be worth talking to companies about, but is like, is it assumed that the company owns the IP after this? Those kind of things can get a little tricky. But if it's the students that are going in for kind of the real world experience and understand that whatever they develop, essentially the company owns, and if that's transparent, then I could see that being okay. But that might be one little point.
The nice thing about being an educational institution is you can ask things that a business typically can't ask, like let the students keep the IP.
Yes, yeah.
Like if another business asked that, they would laugh you out of the room. But as an education institution, you can maybe kind of go hat in
the funny
hand
thing
a
too
little
is this is true of Stanford. I'm not sure if other institutions may have similar things, but essentially, if you're an undergrad and you're working on a project, you own the IP. If you're a grad student, actually Stanford owns part of it. So there have been companies like Google that have gone through. They started when they were still at Stanford, and so essentially Stanford is involved. You know, has some benefit from the IP there. And then
that's amazing.
One of our students, he actually didn't finish the major, but Evan. Why am I blanking on his last name? It's Spiegel, that Snapchat founder. He was in the product design program, and he developed the idea in a different class, not our class, but because it was undergrad, there's no IP requirements there.
Sure,
that's amazing.
I know some of our universities here in South Africa, unfortunately, don't let the students keep the IP. That would, I think, that would also massively impact motivation behind certain projects for students. If that was also a factor that was not advertised, but, you know, discussed and made known to potential students. And I think that would actually change the game a little bit.
Yeah. And I think it's even an opportunity for the universities, you know, when you kind of spoke about how the post-grad, they get the Stanford can actually be a stakeholder in the process. Like to me, that seems like where education should be trying to go.
Yes.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to get the money on the front side of the people coming in, you should be getting the money on the back side for the people going out and succeeding, because they also have the money to give you. And so, you know, if I were to think about what, you know, an institution might look like for the future, it would be something a lot a lot more focused on bringing enterprise into the conversation and letting them create opportunity and a platform to develop new things.
Yeah.
Because I also think a lot of businesses kind of like get a little bit stuck up in what they're doing in the present and don't necessarily think of new opportunities. And that's a great way to enable that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and this is probably a whole other conversation, but I think, at least here in the States, and the situation might be different in South Africa, but there's this whole issue with this huge burden of student debt and people going into majors, and I won't name names, but there are certainly majors that people choose to pursue that it's really hard to land a job afterwards, right? And then that's fine. I think those majors should exist, and there's a lot of interesting intellectual work being done there, but thinking about like how do you support those programs versus the ones, frankly, like ours and other engineering programs where it's pretty clear where you're going to end up, where you're going to get a job, and where you provide value. That's an interesting, I think, debate that needs to be had. And then the whole other thing which really blows my mind is this whole kind of the academic bureaucracy that's built up over the years, where in some institutes, like the bureaucracy outnumbers the undergraduate population, which seems really backwards to me and very costly. So anyway, I don't want to rant about those things too much, but I think there's definitely room for improvement in our university system here.
Okay, so we've kind of taken a couple of detours, so I want to kind of like bring it a little bit back to your story. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the beginning of your experience kind of starting this education department or like your initial experience in InVision? Because I think there are many people who do design, but I don't think very many get to experience what it's like to have an aspect that's specifically focused around learning and education. So can you just talk us through some of that?
Sure. So, when we first started the team, we kind of had this mission, and we had a lot of latitude on how we acted on that mission. And I think my boss at the time, Aaron Walter, also has a background in education. He's taught design where he lives in Georgia. And, I think we understood sort of the basics around how to get somebody trained in these types of tools. What was maybe less clear initially was how would that translate into more of a, from an academic environment into more of a business environment, and what would be, interesting to people and helpful. And I think, we certainly had some success with the books. The podcast was really more experimental, but I think it ended up being, in a lot of ways, even more powerful because you do develop, a more intimate relationship with people over audio. It's just a more intimate experience, and being able to include people as parts of conversations with, very well-known, prestigious folks in the creative fields, from comedians like John Cleese to writers like Dan Pink to fashion designers like Eileen Fisher. These are all people that I feel very honored to have the chance to talk to. But when I listen to other podcasts, it's always great to hear that sort of long form, more intimate conversation with somebody that you don't typically get from most sort of quote mainstream media sources. So I think for that reason, podcasting ended up being a really good medium for the kinds of education that we wanted to do.
So Eli, we had the privilege of also having two previous guests on the show who are both kind of dabblers in industry as well in the educational space. And that's kind of why Alfie and I got so excited talking about the role of education academia within the design industry itself. And I'm quite curious to hear what your experience has been in the industry as being someone who is actively involved in industry, but then also needs to play a very educational role in formal education. And what I mean by that is we can actually see industry change very quickly when we involved as a practitioner or in a practitioner space, Whereas in education, things can take some time. Maybe now you're exposed to some ideas, some things that you really want to take back to your students, and you really want to, this is the stuff we should be focusing on. This is the stuff we're passionate about that's going to change the world in product design. But then obviously things moves a bit slower. You have a curriculum. It's a little bit more formal. How do you, what is that balance that you found? What is that relationship, your two jobs or your two roles kind of play with each other? How does the one influence the other? Or what is the chicken and what is the egg?
Yeah. Well, it's, I think what's interesting too about our program, what makes it different from a lot of the other programs, is pretty much all the faculty are also practitioners. So everybody, even from the director on down, and Dave Kelly is actually, I think at this point, the only Stanford tenure professor that doesn't have a PhD. So he has a background in entrepreneurship, he has a master's degree, but we come at it from a more practical perspective in a lot of ways. And again, I'm not trying to denigrate other fields where the sort of more academic stance is just fundamental to the way that they teach, but I think we are really grounded in the way that things happen, in the workplace as a part of a design team versus maybe, other areas which are just sort of more academic and theoretical. And I think for that reason, we're able to adapt a bit more quickly. We still get, I think, stuck a little bit sometimes in I would say it took us longer than it should have maybe to embrace the trend that was pushing towards more digital versus physical products, but we've caught up with that. I think at this point, and we're actually in the midst of redesigning our program right now. And I could talk a little bit about that if it's interesting. But yeah, I think just the fact that basically the entire faculty does have that industry experience makes things a lot more relevant for the students who are going out
Definitely.
there.
That's quite powerful. Yeah. Sure. Didn't know that at all.
And I think it would be cool to hear a little bit about what you guys are thinking about how things might change a little bit in the future. If you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I mentioned early on that the program was sort of born in the mechanical engineering department. So we have sort of this sort of roots in physical products. And as things have shifted, it's clear that students, most of them are headed towards a more digital direction. And then also as a side note, there's this whole D-School Institute, which was started in the early 2000s by Dave Kelly. And their sort of mission was to bring together all sorts of disciplines to use the design process to work on, challenging problems. And the thing that they didn't do is grant a degree, like that you can't get a degree from the D-School. So that's essentially changing, and our program is merging with the D-School, which probably should have happened earlier too. But again, moving around the academics can be kind of tricky sometimes. So we're merging with the D-School and redesigning the program to allow students to sort of have a core focus area that they can choose, which there'll still be a physical products option, but there's going to be more of a computer science, AI, ML option, and then a more design research option. So those are the three sort of focus areas students can choose to go with. And the program itself, the class structure is changing a little bit. Our capstone class, I think, is going to remain pretty much as it is. But yeah, there'll be these different tracks that the students can choose, and then also different kind of focus areas from energy and the environment to oceans. Even is one of the topics which I'm interested in helping out with. So there's these different faculty kind of advisors that will be helping students in these different sort of academic focus areas too.
That's very cool. I think it always makes me a little bit happy to see, things changing in that on that front.
Yeah.
Because I think that in some ways is the biggest challenge of what it is to be an educator, just keeping up with the times and ensuring that what you're doing is actually achieving, the goals that you would like both now and in the future, which is maybe the harder part.
Absolutely.
And so I think one of the things that I wanted to touch on a little bit, and I would absolutely kill myself if we didn't, is some of the publications that you guys have done. And I think especially just because I think it was it was one of the rungs on the ladder when I was kind of like figuring my way out in design. I think the very first publication that you guys did that I came across was the New Frontier research piece, where you guys kind of like, you know, did a whole survey from companies across the world just to see how they think about design as organizations. And there was this like structure of the 5 different levels. And like after kind of like reading that thing, I felt like I knew everything about design and I could go out and talk to people and like understand, like speak as if I've got all of this background, when actually it was just like a well curated piece of thoughtful knowledge. And I think, I mean, especially, you know, as I kind of went through my career, even while we were working at the bank, which is where Stephanie and I met, I can still remember that some of the design leaders there still use that piece of research, you know, now to justify specific decisions, to make specific arguments. And, you know, it's easy to think about thought leadership as just a person posting on LinkedIn into the ether and it just fizzles off after gathering a couple of likes. But I think when the work is done with that much research and is then repeatable by other people, that's when you start to see the real value of thought leadership. So, what would be really cool is if you could tell us a little bit about the process of, I don't know how much of it you still remember, because it was, I guess, a while ago, but the process of how you came about actually putting that together, that specific piece, and then how that has kind of like moved on into the later publications that you've done.
Sure. So that particular project was done under one of my colleagues, Leah Bewley, who has a, you know, extensive research background. So she did, you know, these surveys and one-on-one research with, you know, essentially thousands of companies in a, you know, in a more quantitative sense, and then one-on-one more qualitatively, and came up with that framework. So I was really mostly just involved with the periphery of that. That was kind of her project, and yeah, she did a fantastic job at it. And I think it's like you said, still carries weight. You know, as far as the other publications, some of them, like the early ones, the Design Thinking Handbook, just came out of my experience teaching at Stanford. Aaron's book, The Principles of Product Design, similarly came through both his teaching and practical experience leading design at MailChimp. Design Leadership, which we co-wrote, was really, you know, Aaron had a fair bit more experience on the leadership realm. I'd led small teams, but he, you know, grew the whole entire team at MailChimp, and so had a good amount of experience there. And then for the following books, we often tried to pick authors who had, you know, domain expertise, whether that was the design systems book we did, or we did a design engineering book and a design ops book. And so those were often multiple authors who would each write a chapter, which, you know, practically speaking was a little harder to execute because you're trying to shepherd all these different authors versus, you know, internally working on it yourself. Yeah. So this took a little longer, but, and then the most recent book, which you touched on earlier, is this Collaborate Better Handbook. And that's really just trying to distill a lot of what we learned over the last 7 seasons of the Design Better podcast into a somewhat coherent framework. And one of the things you probably notice as you page through it is if you look carefully, it does feel sort of like a design thinking framework that we kind of embedded it or layered over it, but we explicitly stayed away from that because we wanted it to be more inclusive of other roles. I think, for better or worse, design thinking has, as a term, has gotten a little overused and buzzwordy over the years, I think, and so it sort of turns people off, frankly, I think, sometimes. So we specifically stayed away from that, even though the sort of framework and foundations are essentially design thinking, because it's about understanding your customers and colleagues, you know, creativity and divergent thinking, building together, those types of things. So those are all things that you work on in the design process, but it's sort of like trying to slip in the medicine with the candy and not talk about it explicitly. But yeah, that was sort of our latest venture.
That's amazing. So there's something that I'd like you to maybe expand on a little bit more about your personal experience in almost doing this. And it's something that I only really started to come across when I started speaking. Because there's this kind of like interesting space when you're learning from other people and creating at the same time. Because, you know, I'm thinking about what your schedule looks like. And on the one hand, you know, you're actively doing a podcast, you're interviewing people, you're learning from them, you're hearing their stories. But then at the same time, you're actually creating a product, you know, a product. Although it's content in some sense, it's still a product.
Mm-hmm.
And have you found like any like, do you usually find that the things that you're learning about and hearing about like kind of affect what you're creating at that specific point in time? Like, how have you found that parallel?
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, I think the challenge, one challenging thing is, you know, kind of going with the confidence that, okay, we have the set of ideas and interviews and research that's worth packaging up and sharing, knowing that no matter how well you do that, you're going to learn something maybe the next week that, gosh, I wish I had included that. I'm even thinking about that during our conversation here because we talked about the Amazon writing, which also came up yesterday's interview. And I'm like, gosh, I wish I had included that because in the chapter on building together, I start off with writing. You know, I start off with how writing is a powerful tool. Didn't include that Amazon example. I'm like, gosh, that could have been in there. But anyway, so I think, yeah, it's one of these things where similar to software, it's really never done, and you could always go back and revise it and make it better. But I think you do have to at a certain point say, okay, I'm confident that we have enough good stuff here that we can package this into something that is going to be helpful to people.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think I've also had a similar sort of experience. You know, I've been doing a couple of conference talks lately, and a few of them were around the same topic, but literally between every one it changes. Just because, well, going through the process of actually doing the talk and then the questions, I found it's always the questions that kind of force me to rethink things and address aspects that I might not otherwise have thought about. And like after a couple of times, it becomes so polished and so refined that you can pose the questions and answer them as you're going through the same set of ideas.
Yeah.
And to me, at least, I find that's when, in some ways, the highest quality outcome actually happens. Just because it forces me to think about things in a way that I wouldn't be able to do by myself. Yeah.
No, it's a great point. And I think that's one of the things that's always challenged me. I do like public speaking. I still makes me nervous, frankly, you know, like getting in front of a crowd, and like I feel like I'm not necessarily a great performer. I'm okay on a podcast or more kind of one-on-one setting, but I feel like I get a little too, sorry, it's okay.
No,
Get a little too, you know, stiff and awkward in front of a crowd of people. Where I feel like I could do better is if it was just a Q&A essentially. And I've almost thought about that. Could I plant some people in the crowd? Because you'd have to have somebody there to be brave enough to ask the initial question. But to me, the talk it would be more useful than, because you don't know what people there want to learn exactly. You know, maybe they're interested in the general topic, but what are their specific questions? And they're probably at different levels of, you know, education and experience. So to me, it would be more engaging to essentially have the whole thing, you know, maybe be a focus Q&A.
Yeah. And I actually agree with you. I think that has probably been one of my main reflections on this process in speaking at conferences. Like, in some way, no matter how interesting your topic is, it's never going to be as interesting as answering a person's question that they care about.
Yeah.
Like it's just never going to compare, no matter how good you are.
Yes.
And so I guess I've been thinking a little bit about what that might actually look like then. You know, maybe it's sort of like, maybe not a panel discussion, but like a group sort of question with, you know, maybe specific people from different departments, similar to how you might have a couple of people on a podcast and just have a conversation centered around a specific question.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think there's interesting ways to go about that. And the one danger, of course, if you're asking for audience participation, I think the one danger is there's often people that just want to have, they don't really necessarily have a question. They just have something that they want to say.
Airtime.
And so they want airtime. So you got to be able to cut them off. you need a bouncer, essentially.
There's a big theme that we touching on, which is, you know, this our industry, and it seems like people in the industry we're all very curious in nature. We're very adaptive. There's a lot of change always going on. And I coincidentally this morning I was on LinkedIn, and I came across this interesting post someone made around where specifically around UX design now, and looking at the more influential figures who have kind of helped us establish a discipline that is separate, and we can now call it product or user experience design. And at which point do we stop adapting and stop changing and stick to the founding principles that we have created, or are those founding principles almost like the gatekeepers of our discipline? And I think it's such an interesting, or it's going to be so interesting to see where this space is going to be at, or this practice of ours is going to evolve into in the next, let's say, 5 or 10 years, because we have now finally not adapted, but we've established some groundwork for what we're practicing. And is that now going to stay? Or are we going to keep pushing and keep changing, but then the principles and the practice itself is just going to keep changing again? And then in 10 years' time, you have a different course at Stanford, and you have a different label for what type of designer you are. Because we are kind of, I feel like we are all kind of the type of people who are those curious, adaptive thinkers, but we also have this need to put stuff down on paper to help guide us to how to actually practice what we love.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think from my perspective, things are going to continue evolving and maybe even evolve more quickly now that things like artificial intelligence, machine learning are entering the picture. I'm sure you both played around with things like ChatGPT and Dolly and these other tools, which are just sort of like still somewhat kind of fun and novel, although ChatGPT, I mean, the things it can do is pretty amazing. Those are going to continue to accelerate, and I think they are going to have an impact on our role as designers. And I think it could go in several directions. I mean, then the negative view is like, wow, it's going to like eventually just take our jobs away because it's going to do them so much better than us. The more positive view is that it's going to be an accelerant and a tool that we can leverage as designers to make, better products. And also, I think designers intrinsically have a lot of consideration towards the ethical side of things. And there's certainly a lot of ethical questions around what, the sort of knowledge and creativity that these systems are harvesting, largely without, any kind of compensation or recognition from the human creators, right? So I think, those are some of the ways I think that as designers and design leaders, we could, play a role in shaping the way that these technologies impact the way that we create products.
Yeah, it's actually, it's so interesting what you mentioned, because I've thought about it before, but I think the way you worded it kind of brought it back to mind. It's sort of strange how design has become like the ethical evangelist in the room. If you think about, it's not like architects were specifically ethical in relation to engineers or construction people or things like that, but suddenly somehow design just snuck in ethics through the back door. And now in a way it's a very real part of what the role we play in the cross-discipline table is.
For sure.
And it'll be interesting to hear a little bit about, I don't know if you've got any specific thoughts on the matter, either of how people could think about their role in terms of ethics and design, or maybe just a couple of experiences that you had specifically around that question.
Well, I do have some thoughts around it. I think you're right that it's sort of kind of crept into the design wheelhouse. And I think one of the reasons is that, we rely so much on empathy as part of our toolkit, empathy for customers, empathy for our colleagues, hopefully. And if you have empathy, I think you have to think ethically about the products you're creating. I also think it can be taken to extremes that aren't very helpful. I think there's this manifesto floating around. I think it's Mike Montero, who's a very good and capable designer, but he goes to sort of extreme lengths, saying things like, there's no such thing as, you can't be an ethical designer if, for instance, you're designing a gun. And I agree that there's a lot of, ethical questions about that. But what if the gun is being used to prevent a genocide, or what if the gun, is being used to save somebody's life? And I think at that point you have to say, well, there are complexities here, and we have to allow for discussions that are more nuanced versus saying this is evil and this is good. There's just so many layers of complexity in a lot of these issues that are worth debating. So yeah, I think, I don't think designers can take it on by themselves. I think they have to obviously improve or involve the entire team that they're working with, and hopefully the leadership as well is behind it. But certainly we can continue to kind of push in the direction that tries to probe the question. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think we're getting to the end of this conversation, and Eli, we don't want to steal all of your time. We know it's quite valuable and precious, and it's been such a nice privilege to just get you in this virtual room with us and actually hear a little bit about your thoughts. I do have one last question for you, though, and I think it's quite on topic of what we've already discussed, and maybe you've kind of already touched on it, speaking about AI and how you think the industry is going to have to adapt a little bit more. But, thinking about, you said you guys are rewriting the course content at the moment. So you've obviously given a lot of thought about, what will be relevant for the future designers in our industry, and what will also be relevant for, on the receiving end, the businesses who will be receiving these students into the world. What would you say or think would be some of the biggest challenges, or maybe even opportunities, that we are facing in the design world today?
Yeah, so I think the fundamental foundation of the program that we teach and that other design programs teach is this idea of a human-centered design that is at the service of creating better products for improving people's lives. And I don't think that's going to change. Hopefully, I think that's something that will stick around. And I think the challenges come in, as we were touching on earlier, with these new technologies, where there may be instances where machines become better at jobs that we traditionally thought of as kind of irreplaceably human, things that are more creatively oriented, things that, that we thought that humans had to train for years or decades to master. These machines will be able to do instantaneously, in some cases better than we can. So, what happens to our jobs as creators when that comes to pass? And I think, like we touched on, I think there are things that designers have in their tool set that are going to be really important. One is the continuing empathy and kind of human-centered portion of it, and then also this sort of ethical orientation that most, I would say, designers have as well, and pushing in that direction. And then also, frankly, learning how to adapt and use these systems as tools to help us become better designers. I think the designers that stick around are going to be the ones that have become adept at using these as tools, as accelerants, and as sort of extensions of our own capabilities. So I remain optimistic. I do think there are, there are real like society-wide challenges that these things are going to kind of force upon us. But I'm hopeful that, smart people working on these problems, including designers, will help us address those.
Make sure there's a designer in the room to probe those ethical questions.
Yeah, that's right. Yes,
definitely. All right. Eli, it's really been a pleasure having you on the show. It's been a great conversation. And hopefully, in the future, I can definitely pick your brain on similar kind of philosophical topics. But for today, thank you very much for making yourself available and sharing some of your experiences and your knowledge with us and with those listening.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. And Alfie, really nice to see you and Stephanie.
Amazing. Maybe before we do wrap things up, if people are interested in hearing a little bit more about what you have to say, maybe reading a little bit of some of the stuff that you're working on, where would you recommend that they either follow you or what type of work would you have them go and look at?
Yeah, well, I'd say the podcast is probably the best place to, and you can find it on all the major platforms, or if you go to designbetter.co, you can find it there. So the Design Better podcast, and then our recent book, Collaborate Better Handbook, go check that out. It's free. Also at designbetter.co. And those are the best places. I'm on Twitter at Woolery. I don't tweet a huge amount, but occasionally I share projects out there. So follow me there, or on LinkedIn. And actually, if I'm always looking to help and mentor people. So if you feel like that would be helpful, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Just let me know where you're coming from, so I know that you're heard me on the show, and I'll do my best to connect with you and have a conversation.
Sure. Amazing. Wow.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And to everybody listening, thank you and have a good day further.
Catch you guys soon.